When did oxygen become abundant enough in Earth's oceans to allow animal evolution?
Hello, my name is Rachel, and I am currently one of GSA's Science Communication Fellows, which means that I'll be popping on here on the Geosociety channel a little bit more this year to share a lot of the work being published in their journals, the work being presented at their meetings, and that's what you're watching right now. I also have my own channel called GeoGirl, and I'll link that below if you'd like to check it out. With that, let's get back to today's conversation.
There have been two major oxygenation events in which molecular oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere and oceans have risen dramatically throughout Earth's history. The first occurred around 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago due to the evolution and spread of photosynthetic bacteria that pumped molecular oxygen into the atmosphere and oceans for the first time. Before that, molecular oxygen was negligible on Earth. And just note that I'm referring to it as molecular oxygen because the element oxygen was around since the beginning of Earth, since the formation of Earth, in all sorts of compounds like water, for example, H2O. But it wasn't until photosynthesis evolved that started isolating the molecule, forming the molecule oxygen in large amounts, which is why we can exist today. Anyway, moving on, the second major oxygenation event occurred around 800 to 600 million years ago, so over a billion years after that first oxygenation event that we call the Great Oxidation Event. And the second one, which we call the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, was caused by a multitude of factors, including the evolution and spread of certain types of algae, as well as major global tectonic changes that were going on at the time. But what's important here, and for this video specifically, is this gap of time between these two events. This gap from around 1.8 billion to around 800 million years ago is nicknamed the Boring Billion. Of course, since nicknaming it this, we've found a lot of evidence that suggests that it wasn't as boring as we once thought. And I'll link a video that I made about the Boring Billion and how maybe it's not as boring as we once thought in the description box below if you're curious to check out more. But one thing that remains mysterious about the Boring Billion to this day is how much oxygen was present in the oceans throughout that billion-plus-year time gap. Most paleoceanographers seem to agree that the Great Oxidation Event, that first oxygen rise before the Boring Billion, may have temporarily oxygenated the oceans to levels similar of that today, but that the oxygen concentrations then bounced back down to lower levels until that second event over a billion years later finally fully oxygenated Earth's oceans, which have remained relatively well oxygenated ever since. However, there are different hypotheses as to what exactly the oceans experienced in terms of oxygen levels during this time gap in between these two events, the Boring Billion. Some past studies suggest that while the surface ocean would have been well oxygenated, because that's where the photosynthesizers were that were producing the oxygen, the deep water column remained relatively anoxic, or low in or completely lacking oxygen throughout this billion-year time interval. Others have suggested that there may have been regional or localized oxygen oases, some local areas of increased oxygen levels throughout this time, but not globally widespread oxygenation, especially in the deeper parts of the ocean, while others suggest that the ocean was fully oxygenated much sooner than we thought. So today we're talking about a brand new paper just published in GSA Bulletin that looks into a potential significant oxygenation event in between these two events that we know of around 1.44 billion years ago that might have more fully oxygenated the oceans sooner than we thought. But they specifically try and use their evidence, their geochemical data that they collected, to answer the question of whether this represents isolated spots or oases of oxygen throughout the Boring Billion, or if it represents a global widespread oxygenation event. Before we get into what exactly they did and what they found, you guys know what I'm going to say next. Why do we care? This question that this study is trying to answer is so important because molecular oxygen is fundamental to complex life. It was potentially one of the major driving factors of the evolution of animal ecosystems, which eventually led to ourselves. It's also fundamental for the formation of redox-sensitive minerals, which not only hold economic value, but also important metals for use in future technologies. And it changed how nutrients cycled through the oceans for the rest of Earth history, for the rest of time till now, which is just insane. And it helps us very much also in answering the question and trying to better understand early complex ecosystems. All right, so now back to the study and what they did and what they found. The authors of this study focused on rocks from the Teeling Formation, a set of shallow marine carbonates deposited around 1.44 billion years ago in what is now northern China. This formation is so great for this particular study because it has both stromatolite-rich intervals and stromatolite-poor intervals. The reason this is important is because stromatolites are fossilized microbial mats. And so within this one section of rock, this formation of rocks, we can compare areas where microbial mats were thriving to areas where they weren't. This is important to get at the question of whether there were just oxygen oases during this time, localized rich regions of oxygen, maybe due to microbial mat activity, versus more widespread, globally well-mixed ocean oxygenation going on at this time. In total, these researchers analyzed nearly 600 samples, collecting geochemical data like iodine content, cerium anomalies, and stable isotope compositions. The iodine, which gets preserved in carbonate rocks, like the ones that they were sampling from, provides us information about the iodate concentrations in the seawater at the time of deposition, which tells us about the oxygen concentrations at the time because iodate is closely linked to oxygen. The chemical behavior of cerium is also linked to oxygen. So studying cerium anomalies of the sediments also helps us to indirectly assess the oxygenation conditions of the seawater at the time these rocks were deposited. And finally, stable isotopes, specifically for this study, the ratio of stable carbon-13 isotopes to stable carbon-12 isotopes helps us to better understand the state of the global carbon cycle at the time these rocks were deposited. A positive spike often indicates an increase in organic carbon burial, which is typically linked to increasing oxygen concentrations. And with these data, they aimed to answer, do these oxygen signals in these rocks represent localized oxygen oases caused by microbial mats, or do they reflect larger scale oxygenation in the water column? If it was oxygen oases or just local pockets of oxygen-rich conditions due to microbial mat activity, we would expect that the stromatolite-rich intervals of this rock formation, the microbial mat-rich intervals, would show us chemical evidence of higher oxygen levels than the stromatolite-poor intervals. However, this study found that the stromatolite-rich intervals did not show higher levels of oxygen or evidence of higher levels of oxygen than the stromatolite-poor intervals. In fact, they were lower. They showed evidence of lower oxygen concentrations than the stromatolite-poor intervals. This is the opposite of what we'd expect to see if these were oxygen oases or just localized pockets of oxygen. And it challenges the assumption that stromatolites in the rock record always indicate local oxygenation. The stromatolite-poor intervals showed elevated iodine at multiple sites, consistent with widespread shallow water oxygenation rather than localized oxygenation. Thus, it's possible that this was a widespread, maybe regional, maybe even global oxygenation event or increase. So how do we figure out if it was global? Well, other studies have shown similar signals, including negative cerium anomalies, positive carbon isotope spikes, and manganese-rich deposits, all of which indicate the presence of and/or increase in oxygen levels. And these signals have been found from other rock formations around the globe that were also deposited around this time, 1.4 to 1.5 billion years ago. These other lines of evidence support the idea that there may have been another oxygenation event around 1.44 billion years ago between the two that we know about so well. Even if this one didn't fully oxygenate the deep oceans, it seems to have done something with regards to at least shallow water at the time. They even calculate that the carbon isotope spike could reflect around a 1.8% increase in atmospheric oxygen levels, which is huge compared to mid-Proterozoic background levels. So this study helps to fill a huge gap in our understanding of Earth's oxygen history. And this Earth's oxygen history is incredibly important for our understanding of Earth's biological history, specifically the evolution of the first large multicellular complex organisms like animals, which coincides in many ways with the evolution of oxygen on Earth. There remains a lot of controversy around this correlation between oxygen and animal evolution in Earth's history, because we initially assumed that the increase in oxygen around the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event, the second one, drove animal evolution, one, due to the fact that animals need oxygen to live, but also two, due to timing correlation. This Neoproterozoic oxygenation event occurred immediately before animals seem to radiate and diversify and completely take over. The Cambrian explosion, but also right before that, the Ediacaran explosion, and some animal-like creatures that may have evolved even slightly before that. So this link between the two, oxygen and animals evolving, seemed to be intuitive and nobody's really questioned it. However, more recent studies have begun to poke holes in this idea that oxygen was the primary driver of animal evolution because, one, early animals may have required only very low oxygen concentrations. Two, correlation does not always equal causation. In fact, it never equals each other. Sometimes there's correlation because of causation, but that's not always the case. And three, the timing of the rise in oxygen levels that allowed animals to evolve and to live on Earth in pockets of the ocean where oxygen was finally present at high enough levels may have occurred a lot sooner than we thought. And this study is one of those that provides evidence to support this idea that the oceans, at least shallow waters where a lot of ecosystems today live and thrive, like coral reef ecosystems, that these types of environments may have been more well oxygenated than we thought before even the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event. And so maybe that wasn't the big driving factor in animal evolution. Maybe there was something else going on there. And I actually have a couple videos that you can follow up with after this video if you want to learn more about this controversy and or what other factors other than oxygen may have driven animal evolution. And so I'll point you next to my video that's literally about the controversy behind this correlation of oxygen and animal evolution, which I'll put on the screen somewhere. And I'll also put up my Snowball Earth animal evolution link video where I talk about this idea that Snowball Earth may have driven animal evolution, at least in part, and how it did so. So anyway, you can check out those two videos next. And with that, I hope you enjoyed learning about this new study, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.